Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our Fresh Seed February clinic, where we're going to be covering the topic of managing relationships and preventing sexual harassment in the games and creative sectors. For anybody who doesn't know us, I'm Alexandra and I'm with Sarah today.
Hi.
Sarah's going to be the one put under the spotlight today, whereas it's usually me. Make a nice change. Just for your information, we are recording today so that we can share with those who aren't able to attend, as well as for some clips as part of our socials afterwards. It is only me and Sarah who's on a camera. So the chat's also open. If anyone's got a question or wants to contribute, then feel free to pop a message in as well. So getting on to the topic, managing relationships at work. It's something that's never simple, never has been, and I'm sure never will be. In the games and creative sectors, where things like collaboration, informality and blurred lines are often a part of the culture, then it can be even more complex, especially with the upcoming changes as part of the Employment Rights Act 2025 and a strengthened duty on employers to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. Many studios and creative organisations are asking the same questions around this. So in today's clinic, we're going to focus on some of the situations that organisations really do grapple with, such as after-work socials, power dynamics, managing relationships with freelancers, generational differences, neurodiversity, and some of those uncomfortable grey areas where intent and impact don't always align. This isn't going to be about talking about policy. It's more about exploring how we can have better conversations, clearer expectations, and thoughtful boundary setting, where that can reduce risk, protect our people, and create a safer, more respectful working environment. And we're also going to look at what all reasonable steps now means as opposed to reasonable steps, what that looks like in practice, and how leaders and HR can feel a bit more confident navigating that space. It is another Q&A style session. If you're not familiar with the way that we do things, this time around I'm going to be asking Sarah a series of questions that have been submitted, as well as those that are coming up quite frequently, which we're seeing right now. And she'll share her thoughts. There will be, I'm sure, a bit of a dialogue between us along the way as well. As I said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And if we have time at the end, we'll come to those. We do have quite a lot to get through, as it is such a massive topic of interest. We might not get time to address all the questions that we have listed, but we do have some linked blogs on our website as well, if you want to take a look there. So, Sarah, are you ready to start?
I really am, thank you.
Okay, so the first question that came our way is, there's a lot out there about the importance of good boundary setting, but what does this look like in practice for managers and leaders?
Yeah, it's a really great question, this, isn't it? And it's one that we see quite regularly, this thing around kind of boundaries and line managers having the skills to lay kind of boundaries and understanding what that looks like. So for us, there's several factors to it. What I suppose it's starting with being proactive. So being proactive across their knowledge base in terms of processes, policies, this piece of legislation in particular related to this, but boundary setting is about understanding kind of all kind of policies and processes as much as you can do, and certainly the ones that are coming up more commonly in day-to-day activities. It's sort of knowing that stuff, sort of rather than waiting for it to come up. That's kind of one of the big keys. And then it's being explicit about kind of how they lead. So sort of it's setting the tone. It's knowing, what's not okay, what is okay, what they can say, and sort of reacting when something feels off. So having an awareness of what feels off. And I think this sort of goes to that piece that we see quite commonly in this industry really widely, is that emotional intelligence piece. So sort of knowing what feels off, rather than reacting with your own emotions, sort of actually knowing that it is off by the facts and the evidence. And that goes back to that kind of knowing your policies. And then consistency. There's lots and lots of research around fairness in the workplace. Lots of that research sort of says when we're unfair, i.e. we favour one person over another, or one business over another, or we don't act appropriately, we cause further conflict. So actually that part is really fundamental to boundary setting, is consistency. And then that kind of sets the tone for psychological safety. Where that applies then to sexual harassment and sexual harassment prevention, it is, again, it's knowing your policies, it's knowing your risk assessments, it's being aware, it's being proactive in knowledge around that, and it's taking all reasonable steps, and we'll keep saying that in today's session, to first be knowledgeable about it, and then know how that knowledge translates into your everyday settings, whether that's out of work or inside of work. And by inside of work and outside of work. By outside of work, what we mean is outside of work socials, outside of work kind of any activities that might be happening, whether that's an event or, or a football match or whatever it might be. Those things, that's where it applies. So yeah, those are the key takeaways.
Thank you. Linking in with that, on the communication side, there's a question. When we talk about appropriate communication at work, what does that actually mean when teams are close-knit and they tend to joke a lot?
So this is a really interesting one. Again, I think it's probably important to say that a lot of these questions that we've got here are questions we see commonly in our client base. So this is one that we see and hear, and it gets raised in the training that we do a lot, about this kind of joke and the banter and where the lines are in banter. I think you've got to draw this back, actually. I think you've got to step back for a minute, and we're talking about sexual harassment prevention here. So we're talking about, there are lots of rules and regulations that are in place and coming into force, but there's also a piece around how do you communicate more generally, what is the tone, what is that saying to people, and how are you agreeing that tone? Because if you're not agreeing that, you create all kinds of negative structures. That comes into those power dynamics that we'll talk about as well. But it also comes into kind of feeling safe to call things out, and feeling safe to say, this isn't appropriate. So how do you actually kind of manage that, and what does appropriate look like? I think you've got to agree that tone. You've got to get that tone of voice agreed. You've also got to have that ability to call it out and it be heard. So this is about, it is back to those kind of leaders, about being able to hear without reaction. So this is about kind of that emotional intelligence pieces. I want you to start looking at the evidence and the facts, rather than reacting with a dismissing or that's just the way it is. It isn't just the way it is. If it's inappropriate, it's inappropriate, full stop. And this legislation brings into that, and there's a case that we can talk about, a little case where that wasn't adhered to properly. And so banter is not banter. If, as my kids' school used to say, if it's not fun for everyone, it's not fun. And unfortunately, I know that this is a thing where the HR go, fun police. It's not that. If it isn't appropriate, we need to be taking measures to stop it. It's a maturity thing, isn't it? It's about being an adult.
Yeah, I think we also see differences across cultures where there's potentially employees or contractors based internationally, and the differences of expectations around that communication and the humour and the banter, and how in one country it can be totally fine to do something a certain way, which we would not see as acceptable, and how that's then translated into communication between management and those employees.
Yeah, it's absolutely that, and I think that's a really good point as well, isn't it? Because I think that's something that we see commonly, is that people misunderstand that if you are hiring people who are not UK based to work with you, you're still applying UK legislation to them. If you're a UK based company, or you're there working in the UK for you and you're not a non-UK, they're employed under UK law. Yeah, that's really important. Okay, next question.
Next question. We've got multiple generations working together. How do we manage very different views on what's acceptable communication or humour?
I reckon everybody will relate to this, because everybody's got those stories about, inappropriate behaviours, even at the Christmas, your family Christmas party, haven't they? Where, this is quite relatable. I think this is an education piece. I think fundamental to this is an education piece, but we're not just talking about telling people that sexual harassment prevention is the new thing that we've got to apply to. We're talking about evidence. We're talking about facts and evidence that support why we need to change. So it's, older generations for sure might see this all as a bit woke. I put up with it. It's all fine, but it isn't fine. We know it isn't fine. We know from data and research into the creative industries, it's far from fine. So we can support that with that data and evidence. And if, by the way, you want that, just come and give us a shout and we can point you in the right direction. Younger generations have been brought up with a narrative. They've been brought up with a language that tells them what's inappropriate, and that's good. That's something that's healthy. So it's about managing those generational differences with accepting that there is differences, and then how do we kind of give evidence and facts and not get caught up into the emotional dramas of things, I think is the way. And it's very hard when people are sort of going, oh well, that's not really my problem. It's very hard to sort of go, well, actually it is your problem. But this is where perhaps group education settings, group training, and a drip feeding of information, reminding people, and then no, that's not cool, and having core people in the team who are willing to do that as well. Because if it is more senior people in the team that are less adapting to this change, then it's having a few core people that might support the narrative around why it matters.
Sure. Okay, next one. We sometimes hear people saying they don't want to speak up or contribute as they're worried about offending others or saying or doing the wrong thing. How can we prevent a culture of fear when we do seem to have a number of employees who get easily offended in situations where others wouldn't?
So with our hat on here, we'd very immediately say, why is that a problem in the culture? What's going on in your culture? And there are all manner of dynamics that might interplay with that. So it could be that people have got a mental health condition, a neurodivergency condition. It could be that they've got things going on outside of work. It could be that they've got problems with their workload. So there could be some real issues or challenges that you need to actually address and overcome. However, if you sort of think, well, none of that really applies, and it's just like some people are really, really sensitive, then find out from them, kind of what's causing that with them, and then also remind them of the boundaries. So remind them, this is facts and evidence. I hear that you're finding this hard, and we validate that you're feeling something. So we're not invalidating your feelings. And we have to move towards these changes, and we have to move towards a place that's fair for everyone, because it's not been fair before. So it's about having those mature adult conversations, I think, and having the skills to do it. It's not always easy, and it's not always easy when it's someone you know well. So it's someone you work well with and closely with. It can be hard, but it's about reminding yourself. I'm trying not to get caught up into that emotional complexity. I'm just trying to remind you that this is why we've got to do this and what matters. And if pointing them towards the policies, pointing them towards the information, the evidence, whatever it is that is relevant in that setting.
It's an interesting one as well, because it also ties in with that whole communication thing again in general of, are people equipped with the right skills to be having conversations in the right way, in the most productive way, to help these type of situations? Because quite often we find that they aren't, and that's where things fall down.
Yeah, and I think that's something really true, isn't it? We talk about this a lot, about that emotion, that sort of the language of emotional intelligence. We all know kind of the language of emotional intelligence. We all know that there's probably something that we need to look at. But actually, it's about a kind of, and we talk about this quite a lot in calls. It's about not having judgment, but having observation. I'm here to observe, and then I might know which lever to pull. So it might be I know which policy to use, or I might know which individual. It might be that I need to speak to HR or finance or whatever it is, but I know which place to point people towards. So it's sort of, yeah, that having a better equipped knowledge to listen well.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on, we rely heavily on freelancers. Do we need to be setting different expectations for permanent staff versus freelancers when it comes to boundaries and behaviour?
No, is the short answer. No, it applies to everyone. And actually, I think freelancers quite often get overlooked in training generally, particularly when it comes to health and safety, and communication styles and things around differences in the workplace. So it's really fundamental. This is not this training, this knowledge, this whole piece is shared with freelancers as much as it's shared with anyone else. But also that kind of talks a little bit towards third-party suppliers as well, doesn't it? And it talks to kind of who else are you bringing in to your organisation, and what are your policies and your onboarding there to ensure that you're safe and you're secure. You have to be proactive in this piece of legislation. This isn't about a piece of legislation that sits on the shelf, so to speak, and is passive. This is very much an in everyday piece of work, isn't it? So yeah, freelancers.
Yeah, the same. And I think that onboarding piece is definitely key as well, because I think freelancers can often be overlooked when it comes to onboarding, or there isn't much of an onboarding process.
Yeah, and the other thing I think that's important to say here is freelancers can be victims of this stuff too. So it's important to sort of make sure that we are, you have policies and processes to safeguard them too. You know, we don't want them to be a victim. We don't want anyone to be a victim of sexual harassment in any form, or anything come to that, any harassment or harm in any form. So this is about being proactive, isn't it? And knowing that you've got processes for everyone that's working with you.
Okay. How do we spot risks linked to power dynamics or seniority?
So this is something that we get asked more generally, not just related to something like this, a lot. Power dynamics are really hard to solve, I think, in general, when you feel the person that's less powerful. I think it's a complex answer to this, so I'm just going to sort of give you some perhaps summaries rather than go into detail, because we could be here all afternoon otherwise. I think one of the things is sort of what's the culture, what's the culture like in your organisation? Is it safe to call things out and speak? Is it safe that somebody who's perhaps more junior can say to someone who's more senior has something that they're challenged with or struggling with? And ask yourself some serious questions about that, because that's really key to all, well, you know, psychological safety, but and certainly it's key here. Seniority and sort of perhaps people who, you know, business founders or what have you, perhaps also feel that they're in a position of privilege and therefore these rules don't apply. And I think that's important, that sort of HR teams and senior people in the organisation also kind of support that change, that this applies to all of us. This is legislation that applies to absolutely everybody, so that supports you know, the business narrative, if you like. If you are seeing kind of risks, it's also about, you know, what other measures you've got, and I think that's again knowing your policies and your risk assessments and your processes, so that you really know what actions can be taken. Now, just on this, and it's really fresh, so these changes, so I'm just going to kind of read some of this out, but there is some stuff around kind of whistleblowing in this legislation shift. And basically that means that from April 2026, disclosures of sexual harassment will be explicitly deemed protected disclosures under whistleblowing law. This gives whistleblowers who raise sexual harassment concerns protection from detriment and unfair dismissal, automatic unfair dismissal, sorry. The Act will also curb the use of NDAs, so that's non-disclosure agreements, in harassment cases. And any clause that attempts to gag a worker from reporting or discussing workplace harassment or discrimination will be legally void. Employers will need to review settlement agreements and confidentiality policies to ensure they comply. So we've got that protection too. That means really the days of sort of just those power dynamics silencing wrongdoing have really ended. And long may that have come.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think that's covered all of that. I'll be here all afternoon, so I'll wait. So I'll carry on. Let you carry on.
Okay, so what risks do you think are unique to creative and game studios that more traditional workplaces might not face?
So great question. So one that comes up a lot. The statistics around this really vary. So I'm going to stick around making kind of an approximate evaluation for you that about 80% of the industry is made up of SMEs. So about 80% of the creative industries is made up of SMEs. And that varies wherever you look at those data. So it yo-yos a little bit, but it's about that. That means that lots of businesses of that sort of size can't afford training, but this applies to everyone. This applies to everyone. It doesn't matter what size of business you are, this applies to everyone. So there needs to be a mechanism to find the funding to get the training. Freelancers are often neglected. So freelancers are often, we've just talked about that, but they're often overlooked in training and signposting and that onboarding piece towards legislation, particularly legislation like this. People with creative industries can have more than one site, or they can be like an events arm, so they can have parts of their business that are actually out in various sites doing various pieces of work. So those are risks, because that's not just about you being putting something on in a venue, that's about the public as well. So those are risks that you need to sort of perhaps manage proactively and be aware of. And then unfortunately, and this is one that I mean gently, but is a fact, is that there's a lot of ego that stands in the way of actually doing the right thing. And so actually this is about going back to those power dynamics and that kind of those levels of how do we call this out, how do we educate people. 20 years ago we didn't think that we didn't think not smoking would be a thing, but now how many times do you sort of walk past somebody and smell smoke and think, crikey, that's a smell I just don't hear anymore. So this change is a change that's gonna take time to sort of feed into our culture, but hopefully over time will. But in the meantime, we've got that transition, and that's the risk, isn't it? Is making sure that everyone is knowledgeable about it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. This next question is something that has come up quite a bit as well. Our studio encourages socialising outside of work, but how far does our responsibility extend when behaviour after work drinks, for example, crosses a line? Is that still a workplace issue?
Yes. Yes, it is. You need to risk assess for this. You need to be aware of this, but yes, it is. And there are kind of layers to this, so that it's kind of can bring people, the business into dispute. There's a problem, so there's certainly that. There's certainly, depending on where you're socialising and how you're socialising, it could be that third party suppliers, apply here. But absolutely, yes, it's something that you definitely need to be aware of and mitigating against. That doesn't mean that you have to be the fun police either. We still want you to have fun. It's just fun safely, right?
Yeah, I think it's going to be even more important now, obviously, with the changes under the ERA. that this does become one of the risk assessed areas, where perhaps previously to now employers wouldn't have done that for a social setting outside of work. But this then feeds into the all reasonable steps.
Yeah.
So it's really thinking of all of these situations which may occur where, as an employer, you could still be liable if something were to happen.
You've got to remember as well, I think when it's out of work socials, quite often alcohol is involved. And of course, what alcohol does is it lowers your filters for life, what's appropriate in life and what's not. So it's just, be all reasonable steps. It doesn't mean you can't not have a drink. It just means that you've got to be very kind of proactive in those risk assessments around that.
Yeah. Staying on the theme of risk assessments, the next question addresses this as well. Are conferences and industry events now something that we should be formally risk assessing?
I kind of want to say I wish we'd been risk assessing them forever, actually, because from a health and safety point of view, you do from a kind of use of equipment point of view. So absolutely, you should be. This is you employ people. They are going to an event in your name. And in the games industry, for example, we have events pretty much every month, if not more than one. So you absolutely have staff that are, all over sometimes the world, actually. So yes, it's important that you take measures. What do those measures look like? Those measures are risk assessments, policies, proactive steps to make sure everyone's trained, everyone's knowledgeable, and everybody's aware. It applies to third party liability, so that is that supply chain. So it could be that you're hosting an event, for example, and you've got caterers. Those people, they need to be. It also means you need to make sure that their third party suppliers kind of align in terms of your processes and your policies, so that there's everyone's set on the same page and everybody's aware together, so that sort of overcomes any challenges. But this is sort of industry events for sure.
Yeah, I think as well on this one, it's risk assessment in general, absolutely, and then focusing on the sexual harassment prevention side of it. Really, employers should be doing that now, even before the enhanced legislation is in place. But once October comes, and that's obviously going to be extended to any form of harassment. So whether that's unwanted conduct related to any of the protected characteristics, so age, disability, gender reassignment, race, religion, belief, sex and sexual orientation. So it's extending it out and making sure that your risk assessment is going to cover you from all of those angles as well.
And that's complex. That's going to take time and knowledge and ensuring everyone is aware. So protected characteristics, well done for remembering them all. It's quite difficult sometimes to remember them all, but there are it's about taking those proactive steps.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, how do we identify harassment risks in informal settings like Slack, Discord, socials, offsite events we've spoken about already?
So this is really, really interesting. And I think in terms of sort of social media and things like, social media channels or Slack and Discord channels and that sort of thing, again, this is a really big subject, and I'm conscious that if we, go into it in too much detail, we'll be here all afternoon. There are some perhaps things that this interplays with, like your IT policies and things like that, how you behave online, even if you've got community managers and that sort of thing, how they're managing kind of that behavior as well. But I think this is making sure your policies are robust. They're robust enough to cover everything. And then it's about kind of those risk assessments. Now, anyone who's doing risk assessments, we've said that word so many times today, you're going to feel like this is a very onerous task. And unfortunately, I think that's true. I think it is an onerous task, but it's better that it is than it isn't. So it's better that we're changing the culture towards this than what we've had previously. So yes, I think this is about making sure that you outline what appropriate behaviours look like, and that people are able to feel safe enough to call it out. You're also enforcing things like the right to switch off, so you're not always online. Those are really healthy as well, because trolling is a thing, right? And lots of people talk about that, and lots of women talk about that. So those are things that we need to be mitigating against, about about thinking about that and being aware of that, and doing some conscious learning around what does it look like, because it can be subtle, but it can also be hidden. So it can also be that people, whatever they are, whether they're trolls or an individual in an organization or whatever it might be sending one person inappropriate images, and that one person who's receiving them they feel so disempowered, they're not able to call it out immediately because they feel embarrassed, they feel that they might have been complicit in some of that behavior, and what have you. So it's very complex, this, and I would say quite sensitive in terms of it. If anyone knows about Emily Attack, she was in The Inbetweeners, she's got a really interesting documentary about this, and that sort of behavior that happens very subtly, and how you actually feel like you're not really in control of calling it out, and actually don't feel able to call it out. So I think it's important that we actually say, as an organization wide, this is what we stand for or against, and this is how we support those voices to be heard, alongside the policies and the processes and the narrative around sexual harassment prevention.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, what should managers do if they become aware of a relationship in their team but no one's raised a concern about it?
So this is quite an interesting one, isn't it, Alexandra? We were talking about this one earlier. We were talking about this. This is one of those things where it can fall into grey areas. So if romantic relationships do happen in work, there is statistics. Alexandra, you might be able to remember it. I can't remember the actual figure, but it does happen. If you feel it's inappropriate, then I think it's speaking to a line manager and speaking to an appropriate member of staff. So that might be HR, that might be somebody that you just want to raise a concern with. If you feel that, and by inappropriate, by the way, I kind of mean sometimes you can see that power dynamic we were talking about just a minute ago in relation to Slack channels and sort of social media. If you sort of think that sort of thing is going on, then yeah, call it out. But if you think it's something that actually this is a romantic relationship and it's quite sweet, then as long as it's consensual, that's okay.
Yeah. The stat that you referred to was 60% of adults have had some kind of relationship in work. So it's almost expecting that you'll come across this at some point. But like Sarah's just said, that it depends on the situation, really. As to whether it becomes an issue, whether there's conflict of interest there, or if it's just something that is fine to continue as it is and doesn't cause any issues.
Yeah, I think where you need to be careful is where there are behaviours that might be grooming kind of behaviours, or behaviours that you kind of are very subtle, but you're not, it's just about perhaps having some kind of eye on how healthy that is, but there's that's a very deep subject and quite sort of falls into safeguarding, and perhaps something we can talk about at a different time, because safeguarding is something that's coming up quite frequently for us at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I'll let you get on to the next question.
Okay. What happens if someone's behaviour is experienced as harassment, but they have a condition that affects social interaction and perception?
Okay, so this is again a really interesting one. This has come up before for us, and I think this again layers to this. So sort of what conversations are you having with people to understand what they're not reading, or what kind of how they're experiencing their their differences in social interaction. So that's something you need to understand. Then it's about what reasonable adjustments can you put in place, and what can you do. And there are reasonable adjustments you can put in place for people, and you can also access funding for that should you need it. And then it's kind of agreeing how it's discussed in a business. So sort of that's not necessarily specific to an individual, but it's specific. How we get my team in, to kind of, those different scenarios around what is inappropriate and how is it being read. And so it's really understanding kind of, it's very tricky. It can be very, very sensitive, and it needs to be delicately handled. But when people do have differences in how they experience social interaction, so it is about being mindful that threat can look very different to some people than others, and it's just mindful of, in that kind of thinking, that proactive thinking, what are you doing to kind of proactively take care of those people as well. And because you're safeguarding, and that kind of falls into safeguarding a little bit, but that also falls into that space of kind of your risk assessments and thinking about like difference in experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, how do we factor neurodiversity into harassment prevention without stereotyping? It's an interesting one.
Again, a really deep one, isn't it? This is really, we could talk about this a lot, because this is something we see an awful lot. Again, probably something we'll do at a later session, I think, because the neurodiversity is about difference, not about difficult. I think it's really important that message is drilled into people. Difference means that there are factors, sometimes they are clinical factors that they have in play. So by clinical, I mean they've been medically diagnosed, i.e. they're not unbudgeable. This isn't about someone being a bit sensitive or a bit woke. This is about somebody with a medical difference that means that they have to have reasonable adjustments to support them, or differences in how they navigate the world. That can be things like rejection sensitivity dysphoria, it can be pathological avoidance, it can be difference in empathy, right? So those are some things, but there's lots of other things. Communication styles, those are different things. Therefore, the kind of times when people don't always understand the messaging. So it's about making sure that messaging is explicit and clear. But it's also about understanding why they don't understand it. So why they are missing it, because you've got a duty of care. So it's back to what we were saying earlier. Now, those are kind of sort of conditions that do fall under neurodiversity, but it doesn't mean that everyone has them. It doesn't mean that everyone is the same, and it doesn't mean that those are things that commonly show up for people. But it's about having an understanding, and as a line manager particularly, it's about having an understanding about how do your threat mechanisms kick in, what is better communication for you, what works well for you. I know Safe in Our World do that wonderful human passport. Those are really, really great things for that, the kind of mindset around how do we communicate clearly, what communication styles matter. And then that means that you can, you're taking that proactive measurement, you're taking that proactive steps to understand difference, but then you're also taking that into your risk assessments. You're allowing people to have adjustments. If it means that they're going to an event, they might have a chaperone with them, so that chaperone can read the room for them. If they're going to a out of work social, does it always have to be a really big noisy space? Could you do something that's a different kind of interaction? And therefore, although that might not necessarily feel like it applies to sexual harassment, you don't know whether that sexual harassment occurs. So it's about those things. And also the same is true on the line, of course. We get that, and so it's just sort of having some kind of knowledge around neurodiversity, I think, in much more detail than we currently do, and actually not knowing just headlines, but knowing much more detail about how it manifests in people.
Yeah. So we're already doing things like risk assessments and providing regular training around sexual harassment prevention as part of legislation that's already in place. With the introduction of now having to take all reasonable steps, I don't understand how this changes. Can you please clarify? And is there anything else as part of the ERA updates that we need to be putting in place?
Okay, so lots of things here. Again, back to my notes. So in 2024, the legislation in October 2024, the legislation did shift. There was a shift towards sort of a more positive legal duty for employers to take reasonable steps. The difference now is that you have to take all reasonable steps. So what kind of reasonable steps felt like was that we did have to do proactive steps. So we did have to do risk assessments where once we perhaps didn't. We did have to have a policy and we had training, but it was a bit more passive, let's say. It was a bit more like, oh, we've done that, let's move on, kind of thing. Whereas this is very much about ensuring that part of your processes are that there's a regular update to training. So by that, I mean all staff regularly updated, but also new staff coming on board, whether that's contractors or employees. So you're always making sure it's embedded into the culture. But it's also kind of making sure your policies are always renewed, making sure your policies are also always adaptive should you in your risk assessment see that there's something that the policy hasn't necessarily picked up. And then it's risk assessments for everything, and it is risk assessments for everything. So it is if you're going to a client site, to an event, to a social, to having people on site, third parties, whatever. It is about that. It's making sure that kind of you are actively doing this in the same way that you do health and safety, really, any health and safety checks and so ergonomic checks and things like that. It's the same sort of thing, I think. Have I missed anything, Alexandra?
No, I don't think so. I think the other thing that can be done now as well is probably more emphasis around like culture check-ins. As well. So if you are doing like engagement surveys, culture surveys, that type of thing, it's a good opportunity to put something in there around the safeguarding and psychological safety side of things and what people are experiencing, to make sure you're covering from that angle as well. I think you've covered everything else, Sarah. I suppose like another note just on the risk assessments is to say with, if you are an organisation that attends like different types of events and they can vary quite a lot, or conferences or their socials and stuff, you can't just bung all of that into one risk assessment. They're all going to have very different risks associated depending on the size, who's attending, the environment, and so on. I know that may seem like quite a lot of work, but like Sarah's already pointed out, it's stuff that from a health and safety point of view would already be done. This is like extending it further to make sure that the prevention's there from a harassment point of view. Yeah,
and I think it's just worth saying there is nothing worse than seeing someone you work with being a victim of something. So when you sort of think, oh, I've got to do another risk assessment, it's better that you're doing the risk assessment and it's offensive than the other way around. One other thing is, I think just on that, and just sort of final note on that, is making sure that the reporting routes are really clear, making sure that people know who and when to talk to. It's a little bit, I suppose, if you think about kind of mental health first aiders and thinking about having those in the organisation, is who can you talk to, who's clear, who can you talk to that's safe, that makes you feel safe.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, we've got a couple of questions left. So we're a really small organisation in the creative space. Do our obligations around sexual harassment prevention differ to that for a large organisation? I think you probably answered this one earlier, but
yeah, no, it applies to everyone. It's the same for everyone. The legislation changes are the same for everyone. You're going to have to find money for it. That's the difference for the training, I think, for this. I think that's the only thing, and that's about factoring that into your budgets really early on, and proactively. I think that's about making sure that you do that kind of annually, and you do that within with new people and so on and so forth. But that very much is part of your kind of risk assessment evaluation anyway, in your process and policy. So no, sorry, you can't get away with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, final one. How do we move away from tick box training to meaningful behavioural change, whilst also meeting our employer obligations?
Oh, that's a good one to end on, isn't it? Right, okay. So behaviour change is one of my favourite subjects, so let's go. Behaviour change starts with facts. Right, so if you think back, I referred to the cigarettes the analogy earlier. If you think back to what we knew when we were changing the culture around that, was we knew it was bad, we knew it caused harm, we knew the statistics of people that were smoking who were ending up with life-limiting disease, right? Same applies here. Know the facts, apply the facts, and it's about how you communicate those facts as part of your training and your narrative around why this is really important. Address groupthink. That's your next one. So groupthink is around, particularly groupthink is a term that's bandied around quite a lot, but actually groupthink applies to negative thoughts and negative structures that limit behaviors. So it's that sort of thing where, a board room might sit there and sort of all confirm each other's kind of thoughts about this organization's terrible, we need to sack half of the team, kind of thing. It's that sort of thinking. So it's going back to that goes back to your evidence, that goes back to drawing back to facts and evidence, and then having an appetite where you know that at least a good percentage of people are willing to go on the journey. With all change, you won't get everyone changing. In fact, you'll still get some percentage of people who resist. So you'll still walk past the people who smoke cigarettes, even though the facts and the evidence stand for themselves. You still get smokers, right? So it's about this change. You can't conquer everyone, but you can at least make a big difference to most people. And so it's then about making sure that your messaging is clear, non-judgmental. Hopefully, it has some kind of, if we make this action, we'll see this decline in behaviours. So you've got some kind of goals in it. You've got some kind of driving factors that help people feel that they're contributing towards something positive. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And that is how those are the basics around behaviour change. Excuse me, finishing with a cough. Right.
Some water. Okay. Thanks. Well, that brings us to the end of the questions that we had. So if anybody does have any further questions whilst we've got a few minutes remaining, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we will wrap up a bit early. So yeah, if you want to take a bit of time just to think of anything you might have to ask us.
Excuse me, I'm just gonna.
Yeah, you sort yourself out, Sarah. Okay. So if anybody does have any further questions about the session today, or anything around harassment legislation, what they need to be putting in place, any further questions off topics that we've discussed, please feel free to reach out to us. Paul, if you can share our info at email, that'd be great. And we can help with anything, whether it's just general guidance, whether you're looking at whether your policies are up to scratch, whether you need training, we can provide that as well. We do have our next clinic in March, which is all around AI. So if you're interested in signing up for that, we'll share the link as well. That will be on the 11th of March, similar time. But otherwise, thank you everybody for attending today and joining us. And hopefully we'll see you in a future one.
Yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you. Bye.